Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Wednesday at about 9:52, kind of a drizzly, gray day. We got some rain last night, but weather since Saturday has been pretty spectacular. So we're coming up on the summer solstice, the official start to summertime, which is my favorite time of the year. I love spring, summertime. I do love the fall. The winter gets a little bit tough just because of the cold. I do like the snow, but I'm a summertime kind of guy, so I love this weather. But anyway, so I want to thank the folks that have been joining in on this channel and commenting, and very very cool. I been doing some shows on some more recent movies that I saw. I went to the movies a couple times recently, and so I saw the new Paul Rudd film Friendship. That was the last movie I saw in the theater. And then trying to think, what did I see before that? Oh shit. God, it doesn't really, it's tough. Um Man, I can't think. There was a movie I saw before. The last movie I saw was Friendship with Paul Rudd, which is an A24 film, which I the review is up on that. Oh, the movie I saw before that was Bring Her Back by the Philippou brothers, and so I saw that probably like a week, 2 weeks ago, and then I saw the newer film, the most recent film, Friendship, and I have reviews for both of those films. I was pretty, I don't know. I think this year is off to a rough start. Um, well, we're kind of in the middle of 2025, and I think it's been a pretty rough year for movies. I will say, 2024. I thought last year was an exceptional year for movies. I try to be, I try to like when I'm talking about movies and seeing movies, because I watch movies all the time, and I love going to the movies, you know, even if the movie kind of sucks, which hasn't been the case. I haven't seen a movie that just totally I felt was an utter disappointment. I will say the biggest disappointment of this year is it was Lee Winnell's Wolf Wolfman. That was the biggest disappointment so far. I I don't know, like that movie was something I was really looking forward to, but I don't know. That movie was such an utter disappointment. And there were so many things where I think that movie got so bogged down with Lee Winnell, and it was a Bloomhouse release, of course, where I think that they what they were trying to do was, I don't know, trying to make a werewolf movie without any of the typical tropes that we see in a werewolf movie. And that can be cool, when it's handled well. I love when you see something new and innovative. I think, getting back to last year, 2024, which was a fantastic year. I think there were a handful of movies that definitely did that. Messed with your expectations. The movies weren't quite what you thought they were going to be, or they had a very different angle. I think Longlegs by Osgood Perkins, which I love that movie. I bought that on Blu-ray last year, or I got it around Christmas time from Santa Claus. And I've only watched it once, but I do want to watch that movie again. But I did see it before on DVD, and I was really, really into it. But that movie really messes kind of with your expectations, because it's kind of built up as it's got, well, a movie that it gets compared to a lot, which I think is pretty accurate, is Silence of the Lambs. We hadn't really seen a movie about essentially, about a serial killer in a long time, and a movie that kind of took an angle of where it was going to be like this mystery film, a murder mystery film, very suspenseful kind of thriller around the hunt for a serial killer. And Longlegs definitely had that vibe, but again, it did something totally different by the second and third act. It brought in a very much a supernatural element, which I didn't really see coming, and it gave the film a really unique blend because on one hand the movie was very kind of grounded, but then it slowly brought in these elements of the supernatural, which I thought was very cool. But that came out in 2024. And with The Wolfman, which was a movie I was so excited to see this year. I love Lee Winnell. I mean, he's a great director. He's made some incredible films. The probably the best thing he's ever done was the remake, which came out a few years back on the Invisible Man. Fabulous movie. And then Upgrade was another movie he did, which is just such an awesome sci-fi movie. Really, really good. I try to recommend that movie when it comes up. And then also he was responsible for the kind of the creation of the Saw franchise. He wrote the first film, also starred in it. I actually do really like the franchise quite a bit. My favorite modern day horror franchise is definitely The Purge. Love that series. Consistent, just kick ass. And my favorite, of course, of all time horror franchise is Friday the 13th. But Purge is, when it comes to like more modern day contemporary horror movie franchises, that is the one. And so, and I think another film that really did something different with say a style or genre that we've seen a lot was In a Violent Nature, which was a classic, really at face value, classic. Well, almost could just say a paint by numbers slasher film. But the thing that was so different about that movie was kind of the narrative and how the movie was shown. We saw that film from the killer's perspective, and there was huge scenes of where there was no dialogue, and the setting was it was all set in the woods, so there was nature acted as kind of its own character. But I think that movie took something that the basic structure, the basic template of how we see and how we've seen slasher movies, where you have a group of young people or teenagers in the woods in a cabin, and they're systematically picked off one by one, and there's a lot of creative kills. There's a lot of cool atmosphere, a lot of gore, and this movie took that completely on, but gave a totally unique way of showing it. So, and I think what Lee Winnell was trying to do with the Wolfman, well, the problem that I saw with that movie, as you can tell, today's show is going to be on my thoughts of, my general thoughts of the movies so far that I've seen this year in 2025. Overall, I've been pretty disappointed. There's one or two movies that I saw that I thought were really great, or that I think were might have been flawed, but I feel that they were still really good. But overall, I feel really underwhelmed by what I've seen so far, and that kind of goes in between, or that's talking about movies I've seen in the theater and then movies I've also rented. And a lot of these movies were films that I was really looking forward to. But I think, like, getting back to The Wolfman by Lee Winnell, the problem with that movie, the feeling, I saw that in the theater. And again, it was something I was really looking forward to because I was like, wow, okay. Because I had heard all of this talk, about that they were going to Blumhouse and Lee Winnell was going to possibly be involved. that they were going to kind of relaunch the, all of the Universal monster films. Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, those kinds of things. And I thought, Lee Winnell knocked it out of the park with the Invisible Man. Did something really unique, really different. It was real fresh. It was a horror slash thriller. Great performances. Just a killer movie. I have that movie on Blu-ray, and I got a chance to see that in the theater. I've seen it a lot of times at home. I've done one or two shows on it. Awesome movie and amazing score. And I felt when I saw The Wolfman in the theater, it felt like there was. My first reaction was that the narrative, the story, how they got to the place of like finalizing the decisions with this movie. I felt it was the problem of like there were too many cooks in the kitchen. I felt like, and I don't know for sure. Obviously I wasn't there, and I haven't seen too much of that as far as what I've read, but I have read a little bit about it as far as how that movie was actually put together, particularly around the story, the main thing. But the feeling that I got was that there was interference. They were trying to do something different, and Lee Winnell, I got the feeling, was not really allowed to do necessarily what he wanted to do. There was pressure, and which is kind of surprising because I feel like he's a director. I feel like studios have left him to do his own thing because he's very creative. He's got an incredible imagination, and he always has this real fresh kind of innovative approach as a director. But I just felt that it felt like there was too many cooks in the kitchen for this movie. I could be wrong, but I know that they did go back and forth. From what I read, because it was put out by Blumhouse, which is owned by Blumhouse Studios, and I felt that I did see that there was debate about the direction of the film, you know, uh, some back and forth, and I feel like it really was detrimental to this movie because they tried to make it really different. They tried to do away with any of the tropes that we see in a werewolf film. The idea of the silver bullet, the shots of the full moon, the transformation sequences, and all the werewolf genre is my favorite out of the kind of the monster films, even though there's not as many. My favorite being The Howling, but there's so many great werewolf movies. I mean, Paul Nash, he's one of my favorite, the great exploitation actor and also director. He played the Wolfman in many roles. But then, The Howling's probably my favorite overall. I was super excited to finally buy that on Blu-ray. And then you have American Werewolf in London. You have, Classic, and then you have Silver Bullet. I mean, there's a lot of great ones, but there's not as many as, in regards to, compared to, say, vampire films, which there's a billion, and then even with films about Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, which there are many, many. So I was really looking forward to it. But they tried to make this movie so they tried to do away with all the typical tropes. They tried to make this film to make the werewolf movie essentially about like a disease or like an infection. And it just never felt like a werewolf movie. But anyway, so that movie was really disappointed. I was really disappointed with that film. Have no desire to see it again. I did a big review on it, and I saw that opening weekend when it came out. Other than that, movies that I did see too that I know any of the movies that really all the movies that I'm talking about in the show, which is essentially just kind of a recap of my thoughts on movies and especially horror films that I've seen in this year, 2025. Movies that I've seen in the theater. I saw quite a few in the theater this year, I guess you could say, and then saw some new releases. But I did see another film I saw in the theater was Heretic. starring Hugh Grant. Really great film in a lot of ways, really great writing, but I felt that that movie ultimately suffered. You know, Hugh Grant's character plays this guy who is has this encounter with these two women who are essentially like Jehovah's Witnesses, and there's a lot of it's a thriller. It's definitely a horror film, but it's definitely a thriller. It's a slow burn movie. It's very much relies on it's very dialogue driven, and the film kind of takes place in one setting, essentially Hugh Grant's house. And the movie is really interesting, and it's a great premise. And the trailer for this movie was great, but essentially, with the dialogue, it's a real kind of deep examination of, you know, of how, for the most part, organized religions work, and how other, you know, religions have taken or stolen ideas from, religions that might have come, thousands of years before. And it's also about how, it religion is used as a form of organized religion is used as a form of like mental slavery. And and it's a deep critique of organized religion. And the kind of the narrative of like what the story is about, particularly like Hugh Grant's character is really great. The supporting cast played, the two girls who are these who are at his house as the Jehovah's Witnesses are fantastic. And there's a lot of tension. You don't know if he is. You get this feeling like you're not sure if he is a pure psychopath, or he maybe he doesn't have these, he doesn't have this, nefarious plan to kill these girls or not. There's a lot of suspense. But the thing about that movie was the message, the overall critique of, in general, organized religion. I 100% agree, but I felt the movie was. I felt after an hour or two of this, and the dialogue it's very good. It's really interesting. It's thought provoking. There's a lot of tension, a lot of great atmosphere, but I thought it got to a point where it was redundant, and I literally I remember telling a friend, while we were after we watched it, I went with a few friends to see it. I felt like I was at a TED Talks um, on why organized religions are inherently dangerous. And I felt like I was being lectured to, even though at the same, which happens, movies that have such a heavy-handed message, or should say, movies or films that have a message. It could be about, socio-political things or relationships or anything really, and in this case, religion. Even though the 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 way the angle the way that's explored, I totally agree with it. But I felt like I was being thumped in the head after 45 minutes. I felt like I was it was too heavy-handed, and I'm like, wow, like these my feeling was, wow, these filmmakers really hate organized religion, and I understand their criticism, but I don't want to be lectured to the point of where they're trying to like make up my own mind, and it's too heavy-handed, and the message felt intrusive that the film had, the agenda, and it took me out of the movie. And then I felt it was too much of that. I felt like I was getting beaten over the head, and it was kind of a regurgitation of the same kind of key points of their thoughts, the filmmakers' thoughts through the screenplay on why organized religion can be dangerous. And it took me out of the movie because I felt like I was being lectured to. And I felt the ending was very confusing. They wanted to kind of introduce these horror elements or supernatural elements. And again, it was similar to, I mean, a totally different movie, but as far as I think the way they wanted to bring in different elements, like I said, Long Legs was a kind of a grounded thriller, the first act, and then it slowly brought in these supernatural elements. And I felt the same thing with Heretic. It was very much grounded in reality, but then they tried to bring in these elements of supernatural, some kind of supernatural quality to it, and it just didn't work. And it ended up becoming this real, I don't know, cliched way to kind of close the story, and it just didn't really make sense in the context of what was already established. So I was really disappointed with the ending of that movie. Whereas I felt getting back to Long Legs, it cohesively it made sense for me, and it still landed its mark, even though it definitely took chances with, because as a filmmaker you can really, or a film just in general can really, you know that can be a, kind of dangerous territory when you kind of establish something, whether it's really grounded or say something that's totally fantastical, and then suddenly you're going to change the tone. That has to be handled really delicately, and I don't think it was handled delicately with Heretic. I did think that that movie overall was pretty good. That the acting was really great. The atmosphere was really cool. It was definitely thought provoking until it was just, it kind of gave me a headache. But I saw that in the theater, but that was ultimately a disappointment. I did a show on that when I saw that movie. The other movie I saw fairly recently was the new Marvel movie, Thunderbolts, which I was kind of like on the fence already seeing that movie because I've talked about it a lot about having, some serious fatigue when it comes to Marvel movies. I'm a huge comic book fan and a huge Marvel fan, especially kind of the first or second wave of the Marvel movies. And I've always said ever since Endgame and Spider-Man Homecoming, there hasn't been a good Marvel movie. Shang-Chi was pretty good, but I felt that movie, other than kind of the opening sequence in the first act of that movie was ultimately, it was never as good as how it started. And there's been 1,000 Marvel movies since Endgame that I've just felt have been just uh, forgettable and disposable and unwatchable. And so with Thunderbolts, I was really, a buddy had, asked me about going, and I was kind of on the fence about it and didn't know anything about these characters going into it. I had a friend who was very much a fan of the original comic books that this movie was based on, Thunderbolts, and he said that he didn't want to see it because they really gutted the story and they really kind of watered it down, and to a degree it sounded like they kind of sanitized the story. And so, but again, it was something, and it was a story, and the Thunderbolts characters, the Thunderbolts world, something I didn't know anything about. So for me, going into it, I went into it totally cold, and I saw it in the theater, and I was kind of on the fence about it. And I liked the film. I thought it was better. I did a show on that as well. That's been up for a while. I liked the film to a degree. I thought there were certain things about the film that were very interesting and cool. But ultimately, I thought, I don't know. I kind of forgot about it afterwards, and I felt, even though again I was not familiar with the characters, and my friend had warned me about what he felt that they had were doing with the story. I did feel that this movie didn't. I felt like Thunderbolts didn't go far enough. It could have been a lot darker. Could have been grittier, and I felt it was kind of watered down. They were trying to do something different, and I think to some capacity they did. But overall, I felt it felt like it could have been it could have had a darker tone. I did, you know, when I did do a show on that movie, I did say that it was considerably better than most of the other Marvel movies I had seen in the last few years since Spider-Man: No Way Home and Endgame, which are just I think masterpieces. I did, I did feel in the moment watching it, and after I saw it, that it was, pretty enjoyable in comparison. I thought it did have, a unique spin, and it was a little bit of, it felt fresh, but the day or two after, in the subsequent days after, I just kind of felt like I was forgetting about the movie. Nothing really stuck with me. Nothing really resonated with me, and I thought, it's okay. It's not a terrible movie. I will say it's not a terrible movie. It's kind of watchable. It's kind of entertaining. There is some real interesting ideas. Some of the characters are great, but ultimately, I was like, I was kind of indifferent to it. So that was, at the end of the day, seeing that movie was definitely a disappointment. That movie was heralded as this big thing. It was really, really hyped. It didn't do well in the box office, and a lot of the whole thing was like kind of being panned as this movie that's going to regenerate interest in the whole Marvel universe and make people excited again about going to see uh, comic book movies again. But ultimately, I don't think it did. And it didn't in the box office. It didn't connect with people because that movie was a big giant turd as far as from what I heard. I don't know how Marvel does it. They make $1 bazillion even with movies that don't do very well at the box office, but yet they keep turning them out, and there's no fucking end in sight. So I don't know. Yeah, but that was the last one I saw, and I still feel the same way. I'm not anymore, other than Deadpool and Wolverine, which I thought was amazing, which is such a unique thing compared to everything else. I'm kind of at the same place where I'm just like tired and bored and just like need a break from Marvel movies. Even though I am in my heart's heart, I am a hardcore Marvel MCU fan. So it's weird. And that was Thunderbolts was I think I saw that maybe a little less than a month ago. And then the other film I saw this year was Bring Her Back. And I thought that movie was, again, really interesting. It was another A24 film, a very interesting movie. It presented some really interesting ideas. It was a very fresh, kind of original take of, doing something new and different in the horror genre, I felt like. But I felt that that movie was so ambitious, and they brought in so many different elements, particularly around the story, like very specific things as to why certain things were happening. What was the motivation of certain characters. They brought in a lot of these different elements, and then I felt they just by the end of the film they just kind of abandoned all of that. They didn't connect the dots with any of these things that they brought in. And that movie was a really, at the end of it, it was a very disappointing movie. I don't understand the hype of around that movie where people are saying that this movie is like, it's pretty gruesome. It's definitely gruesome. It is definitely not a feel good movie. It's kind of a fucked up movie, and it's pretty gnarly. There's some pretty insane kind of practical effects, I will say, and it definitely has this very fresh, unique kind of approach. But again, it suffered from like establishing these kind of key elements or potential key elements as to what is really happening, and then they are kind of abandoned by the end of the film, and we never get an explanation as to why were these ideas presented in the first place. And I left. I thought it was good. I was really into it for a while, but then when I felt like none of these things were really explained, and it was never really connecting for me. I ultimately was, I left the film kind of frustrated. And I love ambiguity in movies. I love when a movie has, you know, this kind of maybe mysterious or unconventional ending where, as a viewer, you kind of have to make up your own mind a little bit, as to like why this is happening or why this is here or this or that. And that can be wonderful, and that's great. But, I need to know. I mean, I think a perfect example of that, even though it's a totally different kind of a movie, is Eyes Wide Shut. Very ambiguous, very a very mysterious story and conclusion, and you kind of like have to like make up your own mind as to like what was reality or what you at least kind of perceive to be reality. Even though things aren't necessarily all explained, there's a balance, and it does it. And Kubrick did it in such a masterful way, whereas this film doesn't do that. So, and then the last movie I saw in the theater was Friendship, by starring Paul Rudd, and again, it was funny until it wasn't. I thought some of the cool aspects of that movie were, with the cinematography, the direction, the music, and the tone of the film. It's a pretty dark movie, and it's about like kind of an obsessed relationship, or a friend who is like, or a person who's obsessed with another person. Kind of leads to a series of events happen where the other person is kind of basically being stalked. For a pretty dark premise, something we've seen a lot before, and it's very funny. But then a lot of the jokes in the movie are just like dead air. I didn't get the comedy, and I didn't really, it was so much of that I kind of felt a little bit like, it's just not really that funny, and there was too much of this kind of method of comedic storytelling that I just didn't get into it. It took me out of the movie. It wasn't a bad movie, and it was entertaining and it was fun, but ultimately I was like, kind of like Thunderbolts. Not a bad movie, has some really great elements, but ultimately a very mixed bag. And by the conclusion of it, I was just like, So very weird. The best movie I've seen this year has definitely been The Monkey by Osgood Perkins. That movie was entertaining as fuck. It was a kind of an adaptation of a Stephen King story. Really great movie. Super funny, incredibly gory, really dark, and but just had lots of other interesting elements. It was very gory. It had this kind of grindhouse vibe to it. Super entertaining. Really cool movie. That was Monkey. The Monkey by Osgood Perkins was easily the best movie I've seen this year. I love him as a director. He of course directed Longlegs, and he also directed the Blackcoat's Daughter, which I have not seen yet, which I'm really excited to see at some point. I really want to track that down. Really great, great director. He's got another new movie coming out. He's such an interesting director, and he's got such an original voice. And then finally, the movie that I do really want to see again, but again, I felt like it didn't all connect. Is Sinners. Very good movie. Star Michael B. Jordan. A really great. It's essentially a vampire movie. I saw that in the theater too. Beautiful dialogue, beautiful cinematography, fantastic acting, and very ambitious, very complex story. A movie about many things. Cultural aspects, particularly around African American history and music and culture. It's a deep exploration of that, but then also about social issues in regards to racism. And it's a fantastic movie in so many ways. But long story short, I just when I saw vampires, Malik, I think was his name, who was the head vampire. I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but essentially when I saw him do the when I see a bunch of vampires doing the Irish jig, it took me out of it. I was just like, and I know that sounds a little bit narrow-minded to say that, but I checked out. The movie is essentially it's very much a musical in a lot of ways, and I just felt like there's so many awesome things about this movie. I just felt like there should have been somebody or someone who kind of like pulled it back a little bit. Like I felt like it went too far into turning it went so far into becoming a musical that I kind of checked out. It and I know it's a film that's been really loved by a lot of people, and people have been calling it, one of the best movies I've ever seen, and one of the greatest movies I've ever seen, and all these things. And I understand that, but I really wanted, I just felt the musical elements took me out of it. I do really want to watch it again. I did post a review of that movie, and it was kind of a mixed bag because of that. And again, I think that movie also suffered from a few things, especially where I felt like there were two endings to the movie, which I thought was disappointing. Like, and they introduced other elements. They introduced some interesting elements in this movie that were never really explored again. I'm very much the lone man out criticizing this movie because everybody and their grandmother has loved this movie. And I do think it is, in a lot of ways, a really fantastic movie, but I felt there were a lot of things around it that, you know, for me ultimately were kind of a disappointment. So, a very mixed bag this year. Easily the best movie I've seen is The Monkey by Osgood Perkins. Just a super entertaining, awesome movie. And really interesting, really unique. So I just wanted to do a little show where I just kind of recapped on all of the movies that I've seen so far. And also, I did see recently, I just uploaded two reviews on Mickey 17 by starring Robert Pattinson, directed by Bong Joon-ho, who is an incredible director. That movie was kind of a mess, um, kind of a letdown. I was really anticipating that movie. Mark Ruffalo's character, who essentially plays Donald Trump, was good until he wasn't. He kind of was annoying. And again, that movie got a little too heavy-handed with a lot of those things. Even though I totally agree with kind of the political view that movie takes a stand on or with, it was ultimately disappointing. So, and then another movie I just did a show on is Steven Soderbergh's Black Bag, with Kate Blanchett, a spy thriller film that was one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. So, yeah, a lot of disappointments, a lot of letdowns, a lot of movies that are okay, but nothing great. Easily the best movie I've seen this year is The Monkey by Osgood Perkins. The least talked about of all of these movies. So anyway, I wanted to do just a quick show on kind of a recap of 2025. Peace.